Darius Bell leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowed at the email glowing on his screen. His office, perched high above the Los Angeles skyline, was flooded with golden afternoon light. The message was from the Morning Exchange, the highest-rated talk show in the country. They wanted him as a guest for a segment titled The Black Tech Boom, Talent or Special Treatment. "Here we go again," Darius muttered. He had seen this before. A mainstream platform suddenly remembering that black entrepreneurs exist, parading them on screen for a brief moment of applause before moving on to the next trending topic. Except this time, the stakes were higher. Innovis, his company, had just landed a $200 million defense contract outbidding some of the biggest names in the industry. That wasn't luck. That was 2 decades of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Tasha, his assistant, leaned against the doorway with a tablet in hand. "You gonna do it?" Darius rubbed his temples. "I don't know. You know how these shows work," Tasha said. "They build you up just to tear you down." Darius's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. The title of the segment alone was a trap, a setup to frame his success as a product of affirmative action rather than merit. "It's national exposure," he said. "Let's see what they've got." Tasha sighed. "Just don't let them bait you." Darius gave a slow nod, though deep down he knew the game. If this was a setup, they were playing chess with the wrong man. As Tasha left the room, Darius stared at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The last time he had hesitated this much was years ago when he stood outside the University of Alabama's admissions office, wondering if they'd reject his application like the others had. His mother's voice had been clear in his ear that day, "Go in there like you own the place." And that's exactly what he planned to do on the Morning Exchange. The studio lights were blinding, reflecting off the sleek glass coffee table between Darius and Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor. "Darius Bell," Madeline began with a dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "CEO of Innovis, a true American success story." Darius nodded politely. "Appreciate you having me." Madeline crossed her legs, flipping through her cue cards. "Let's get straight to it. Your company recently landed a $200 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in the tech world." "That's impressive." "It was a long process," Darius said smoothly. "We developed a security encryption system that outperformed the competition." "Simple as that." Madeline smiled thinly. "Groundbreaking work, some have called it." A subtle pause. "But others have raised questions." Darius's expression didn't change. "Questions?" She picked up a card and read from it. "Some industry experts suggest that Innovis benefited from certain federal diversity incentives. That companies like yours have an advantage because agencies are looking to diversify their vendors. That perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota." Darius's jaw tightened, but his smile remained calm. "Funny how that works. When Elon Musk wins a NASA contract, no one asks if it's because of diversity. When Jeff Bezos secures a government deal, no one wonders if it's because of his background. But when someone who looks like me wins, suddenly, it's about a quota." Madeline's expression sharpened. "So you're saying race played no role at all in your success?" Darius's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you this," he said. "Do you really think I'd be sitting here right now if I wasn't exceptional at what I do?" Madeline blinked. The cameras were locked on them now. Darius pressed on. "If I fail, it's proof we weren't ready for leadership. But if a white CEO bankrupts a company, he's given another chance. So let's stop pretending the playing field is even." A ripple of tension spread through the studio. The producer off-camera glanced nervously at the control room. Madeline's eyes narrowed. "That's an interesting perspective." She leaned back, her smile sharpening like a blade beneath silk. But let's address another perception. Some say that black entrepreneurs receive more attention because their stories of struggle are easier to market. Darius chuckled softly. Oh, so now we get too much attention. Madeline's smile stiffened. She wasn't expecting him to laugh. You're telling me that in a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, the real issue is that people like me are getting too much press? Silence. Darius leaned forward, his voice low and steady. The truth is, success isn't handed out in a lottery. People like me have to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table. Madeline sat very still. The air in the studio crackled with quiet tension. And then Darius smiled. Game over. The clip hit social media like a wrecking ball. Darius Bell just exposed the system on live TV. This man just ended affirmative action propaganda. Powerful. Raw. Truth. Within hours, news networks picked it up. CNN called it a reckoning for America's meritocracy. Fox News labeled it corporate entitlement at its worst. In the boardroom of Innovis the next morning, Tasha sat across from Darius, scrolling through her tablet. We've had 50 new investor inquiries since the interview, she said. Darius raised an eyebrow. And the others? She hesitated. 3 major partners pulled out. Darius's jaw tightened. Expected. And, Tasha's voice dropped. We received a package. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One word printed in thick, black letters. Enough. Darius's eyes darkened. He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. They're not going to scare me, he said. Tasha's brow furrowed. You sure about that? Darius's gaze hardened. Absolutely. Darius stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the city below. His phone buzzed with a private number. Mr. Bell, a voice said. You've made some enemies. Darius's hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? You'll find out soon enough. The line went dead. Darius turned as Tasha entered, her face pale. We have a problem, she said. What now? There's a leak, she said. Someone inside Innovis has been feeding information to the competition. Darius's blood ran cold. Who? Tasha hesitated. Michael. Senior VP. Darius's chest tightened. Michael had been with him from the beginning. Set up a meeting, Darius said. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. Michael had made his choice. Now it was Darius's turn to respond. Darius sat at the head of the long glass conference table in Innovis's executive boardroom, the floor-to-ceiling windows casting the Los Angeles skyline behind him like a backdrop of power. Michael sat across from him, his neatly pressed suit barely hiding the tension in his shoulders. Tasha stood near the door, arms crossed, her eyes sharp as a blade. Darius folded his hands on the table. His expression was calm, too calm. I'm going to ask you one question, Darius said, his voice low and steady. Answer carefully. Michael's jaw tightened. He adjusted his tie. Of course. Did you sell us out? Michael's mouth twitched. I don't know what you're talking about. Darius's eyes narrowed. You don't. Tasha slid a tablet across the table. A video began playing grainy security footage of Michael in a dimly lit restaurant, shaking hands with a senior executive from one of Innovis's largest competitors. Michael's face drained of color. Care to explain? Darius asked. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. I gave you a seat at this table, Darius said, his voice sharpening. I trusted you. And you put a knife in my back. Michael's gaze darted toward the door, but Tasha stepped into his line of sight. Who paid you? Darius asked. Michael swallowed. It's not what you think. Try me. Michael hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice a whisper. It wasn't the company. It was political. Darius's gaze darkened. Who? Michael exhaled shakily. Senator William Cross. Darius's head tilted slightly. Cross was one of the most influential figures on the Senate Defense Committee. If Cross had orchestrated this, then this wasn't just about Innovis, it was about control. They don't want you in the game, Michael said, his eyes desperate now. Innovis winning that contract, it shook the foundation. You weren't supposed to win. They're trying to fix it? Darius's jaw clenched. And you helped them. Michael's hands curled into fists. They said they'd bury the company if I didn't cooperate. You should have come to me, Darius said. You couldn't have stopped it? Michael's voice cracked. They control the game. Darius leaned forward, his eyes like steel. Then it's time, he said, to change the game. Michael's gaze flicked toward the security guard now standing in the doorway. You're done here, Darius said. Michael's mouth opened in protest, but two guards stepped forward and lifted him to his feet. Michael's gaze turned desperate. Darius. You made your choice, Darius said coldly. Michael was dragged from the room. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. Tasha crossed her arms. What now? Darius stood, his gaze fixed on the city outside. Now, he said, we hit back. 2 days later. The press conference was packed, reporters from every major network crammed shoulder to shoulder, the hum of whispered speculation filling the air. Darius stepped to the podium, his tailored navy blue suit crisp under the harsh lights. Cameras flashed. Thank you for coming, Darius began, his voice calm and even. I'm going to keep this simple. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He opened it. Innovis secured the government contract because we outperformed our competitors in security encryption, logistics, and implementation. That's a fact. A murmur ran through the crowd. But it seems, Darius continued, that some people can't accept that success when it comes from someone who looks like me. The murmurs became louder. Darius pulled out a sheet of paper and held it up. Senator William Cross and his associates have been working behind the scenes to sabotage Innovis through illegal back-channel deals. The room erupted. I have evidence, Darius said over the noise, that Cross pressured certain government agencies to investigate Innovis under false pretenses. Not because we did anything wrong but because we succeeded. The reporters shouted over one another. Are you saying the government targeted you because of race? One reporter asked. Darius's gaze sharpened. I'm saying, he replied, that the system has always been designed to keep people like me out. But I got in anyway. And now they're trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. Do you have proof? Another reporter shouted. Darius held up the folder. Every email. Every contract. Every phone call. I'm turning it over to my legal team. You're declaring war, someone asked. Darius's smile was cold. They declared war first. 2 days after the press conference, Darius was back in his office when Tasha burst through the door, phone in hand. They pulled the contract, she said. Darius's heart sank. What? The Department of Defense, she said breathlessly. They cited security concerns and pulled the contract. Darius's jaw tightened. That's impossible. We passed every inspection. They're covering their tracks, Tasha said. Darius stood. His hands curled into fists. Stocks crashing, Tasha added. Investors are bailing. Darius turned toward the window, his reflection dark and distorted against the glass. They're trying to kill Innovis, he said. Tasha stepped closer. They think you'll back down. Darius's gaze sharpened. Then they don't know me. 48 hours later. Darius sat in the back of a black SUV, his expression hard. Across from him sat Daniel Wright, a former FBI investigator turned private consultant. "You sure you want to do this?" Wright asked. Darius's gaze was steady. "I'm not losing this company." Wright handed him a file. "We traced the back channels. Cross's campaign fund is linked to a POC that also funded several competitors who bid on the same contract. They paid to keep us out," Darius said coldly. Wright nodded. "And there's more." He handed over another document. This came from an anonymous source. "It's a direct order from Cross's office to blacklist Innovis from all future government contracts." Darius's eyes narrowed. "Why are you showing me this?" Wright's gaze was sharp. "Because it's time someone brought these people down." Darius leaned back, his jaw tight. "They want a war," he said. His gaze darkened. "Let's give them one." Darius stood in the Capitol Hill hearing room, flanked by his legal team. Cameras were fixed on him. Senator Cross sat across the aisle, his expression cold and calculating. "Mr. Bell," the chairman said. "Do you have evidence to support these allegations?" Darius stood and approached the podium. He slid a USB drive into the laptop connected to the monitors around the room. The screen lit up with email transcripts, bank transactions, and private communications, all linking Cross and his associates to the sabotage of Innovis. "This is the truth," Darius said. "Now let's see what you do with it." Cross's face paled. His chief of staff whispered frantically in his ear. Darius smiled faintly. Checkmate. The fallout was immediate. Cross resigned 2 days later, his career in ruins. Innovis's contract was reinstated. Darius sat in his office, Tasha at his side. "You did it," she said. Darius's gaze was steady. "Not yet." Tasha frowned. "What do you mean?" Darius's gaze sharpened. "They came for me because they thought I didn't belong," he said. "Now I'm going to make sure they can't stop the next person from getting through." Tasha smiled. "So what's next?" Darius leaned back, eyes dark and dangerous. "We change the rules." Darius stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the Los Angeles skyline glittering beneath the fading twilight. The city looked calm, too calm. A dangerous calm. The kind that usually comes before a storm. Tasha stood behind him, her arms crossed. "They're still talking about you." Darius's reflection in the glass was sharp and angular, his eyes dark. "Good. The Pentagon reinstated the contract this morning," Tasha said. "Our stock's already rebounding." Darius didn't smile. "And Cross?" "Buried," Tasha said. "The scandal ruined his political career. He's probably going to retire somewhere in Florida." Darius's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "So it's over," Tasha said. "No," Darius said softly. Tasha's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Darius turned. His expression was hard. Cold. Calculated. "Cross was a pawn," he said. "There's someone else behind him." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Darius's phone buzzed. "A private number." He answered. A familiar voice drifted through the line. "Low. Controlled. Dangerous." "Congratulations, Darius," the voice said. Darius's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "Did you really think this was over?" Click. The line went dead. Darius lowered the phone slowly. His gaze sharpened. "They're not finished," he said. Tasha's eyes widened. "Who was that?" Darius's gaze darkened. "The next level." 2 hours later. Darius stood in a private underground parking garage. The concrete walls were cold and damp, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing through the space. A black sedan pulled up. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Daniel Wright, the former FBI consultant who had helped Darius uncover Cross's operation. Got your message, Wright said. What's going on? Darius stepped toward the car. His expression was grim. Someone else was backing Cross. Someone bigger. Wright's gaze sharpened. What do you need? Information, Darius said. I need to know who's behind this. Wright hesitated. If it's bigger than Cross, you're looking at serious power players, defense contractors, lobbyists, maybe even the intelligence community. Darius's expression didn't change. Find them. Wright nodded once. This isn't going to be clean. I don't need clean, Darius said. I need the truth. 3 days later. Darius sat at the head of a sleek black conference table inside Innovis's headquarters. Tasha sat to his left, Wright to his right. Wright slid a folder across the table. Meet Senator Daniel Sterling, Wright said. Chairman of the Senate Defense Committee. He's been quietly backing contracts for certain defense firms for years, companies that coincidentally were outbid by Innovis. Darius flipped through the file. Photographs of Sterling shaking hands with various defense contractors. Bank transfers. Offshore accounts. He's been building a monopoly, Wright said. Innovis was never supposed to win that contract. Darius's gaze hardened. So Cross was the distraction. Sterling's the real target, Wright said. Tasha leaned forward. So what now? Darius closed the folder. His gaze was cold. We take him down. A black tie gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The elite of Washington and Wall Street filled the marble hall beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. Darius entered through the side entrance, adjusting the cuff of his tailored tuxedo. Tasha walked beside him, her crimson evening gown a sharp contrast to the sea of black and white. You sure about this? Tasha asked. Darius's gaze was steady. He'll be here. Senator Daniel Sterling stood near the central sculpture, a glass of champagne in hand. He was tall, with silver hair and an easy smile. The kind of man who had spent his entire life being told he was special. The kind of man who never had to fight for a seat at the table. Sterling's gaze drifted toward Darius. He smiled. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, Sterling said as Darius approached. Darius extended his hand. Sterling shook it. I suppose congratulations are in order, Sterling said. Quite the accomplishment. Darius's smile was cold. Appreciate that. Sterling's smile sharpened. Though I'm sure you understand how fragile these victories can be. Darius's gaze darkened. Is that a threat? Sterling chuckled. Just an observation. Darius leaned closer. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You came for me, Darius said. Now I'm coming for you. Sterling's smile faded. Good luck with that, he said. Darius smiled faintly. I don't need luck. Darius sat across from Madeline Royce at a high-end hotel bar. The atmosphere was dim, the sound of clinking glasses and low jazz filling the air. I'm surprised you called, Madeline said, swirling her drink. I need you, Darius said. Madeline's eyebrow lifted. Oh. Darius slid a USB drive across the table. That's everything on Sterling, he said. Bank accounts, campaign donations, shell companies. Madeline's eyes widened. This would destroy him. I know, Darius said. Madeline hesitated. And what do you want in return? Darius's gaze sharpened. Full coverage, he said. Not just Sterling. The system. Madeline leaned back. That's dangerous. Darius's expression didn't change. Do it, he said. Madeline's gaze held his. Then she smiled faintly. Looks like you just made the news cycle for the next decade, she said. Darius stood. Good. 24 hours later. The headline hit every major outlet. Senator Daniel Sterling caught in defense contract scandal facing ethics investigation. Sterling resigned that evening. Federal prosecutors were already drafting charges. Darius watched it unfold from his office, the glow of the television screen reflecting in his cold eyes. Tasha entered the room. "You did it?" Darius's gaze didn't shift. "No," he said. "I started it." 3 weeks later, Darius stood at the edge of a private airstrip. His black overcoat billowed in the wind. Wright approached him. "Sterling's gone. The defense contracts are under federal review. And in Avis." "Stable," Wright said. "For now." Darius's gaze sharpened. "They underestimated me," he said. Wright smiled faintly. "They won't make that mistake again." Darius's phone buzzed. A message. From an unknown number. "Congratulations. Let's talk soon." Darius's gaze darkened. "They're already planning the next move," Darius said. Tasha approached. "So what's the plan?" Darius's gaze sharpened. "We stop playing their game," he said. Tasha frowned. "And do what?" Darius turned toward the jet. His smile was dangerous. "We make our own rules." 6 months later, Darius Bell stood at the edge of a private terrace overlooking Washington, D.C. The city lights stretched out beneath him, flickering like 1,000 tiny fires. He had won. Innovis was stronger than ever. Senator Sterling was disgraced and out of office. The defense contracts were flowing again. And yet, the game hadn't ended. Tasha appeared at his side, holding 2 glasses of bourbon. She handed him one. "You know what they're saying?" she asked. Darius took a sip, his gaze steady. "Let me guess, some are calling me a visionary. Others are calling me dangerous." Tasha smiled faintly. "Mostly dangerous." Darius's lips curled slightly. "Good." Tasha leaned on the balcony railing. "So, what's next?" Darius's gaze drifted toward the Capitol building in the distance. "They think they've contained me," he said. "They think I've reached the peak. And they're wrong." 2 weeks later. The black tie gala at the White House was an exclusive affair. Only the most powerful business leaders and politicians were invited. Darius entered through the marble entrance, his tailored tuxedo immaculate. Every head turned. He walked straight toward the center of the room, where a group of senators were speaking with the Secretary of Defense. The conversation stopped as he approached. "Mr. Bell," the secretary said, smiling thinly. Darius extended his hand. "Madam Secretary. You've made quite an impact this year," the secretary said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Darius's smile was cold. "Only getting started. Are you here looking for more contracts?" "No," Darius said calmly. "I'm here to make sure the next contract goes to the right company." "And which company would that be?" Darius's gaze sharpened. "Innovis." The secretary's smile faded. "You're assuming the government will continue working with you." Darius's smile widened slightly. "I'm not assuming anything." The secretary hesitated. "Are you trying to influence the process, Mr. Bell?" "Influence?" Darius chuckled softly. "No. I'm ensuring it." A flicker of unease passed through the secretary's gaze. "You know," Darius said, voice lowering, "the system's not going to change itself. So I've decided to make a few adjustments. And if the government pushes back..." Darius's smile didn't fade. "They tried that already," he said. "Didn't work out too well for them." 1 month later. Darius sat across from Wright in a sleek, private office overlooking the Potomac River. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. "The Department of Defense just approved Innovis for 3 more contracts," Wright said. Darius's gaze was steady. "Good. But," Wright added, "there's pressure from Capitol Hill." Some senators are concerned you're gaining too much influence. Darius smiled faintly. Influence is the point. Wright leaned forward. Darius, you know what this looks like, right? You fought against the system for so long, but now you're becoming the system? Darius's smile disappeared. His gaze sharpened. No, he said. I'm fixing the system. And if the system resists? Darius's eyes darkened. Then I'll break it. 2 weeks later. Madeleine Royce stood outside the Innovis headquarters, microphone in hand. The camera light blinked red. This is Madeleine Royce reporting live from the Innovis headquarters, she began. In the past 6 months, Darius Bell has risen to become not only the most powerful tech CEO in the country, but one of the most influential figures in Washington. Supporters call him a visionary. Critics call him dangerous. But one thing is certain: Darius Bell has changed the game. Madeleine's gaze sharpened as she continued. The question now is, how far is he willing to go? 1 year later. Darius stood on a private terrace in New York City, the Empire State Building illuminated behind him. Tasha handed him a glass of champagne. Congratulations, Tasha said. For what? Darius asked. You're officially the most powerful businessman in the country. Darius's smile was small and sharp. That's not enough. Tasha's brow furrowed. What more is there? Darius's gaze turned toward the city lights. His voice was quiet, dangerous. Control. Tasha's expression darkened. And how do you get that? Darius's smile widened. I stop playing their game, he said. And make them play mine. Final scene. Darius sat in a dark room, his hands clasped in front of him. Across from him sat 3 men in dark suits: lobbyists, government insiders, power players. They were nervous. The government has concerns, one of the men said. About what? Darius asked, his tone calm. Your influence. Your reach. Darius's gaze was cold. And? You can't control the system, Mr. Bell. Darius leaned forward. Watch me. Silence. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. Darius's smile was slow and sharp. You thought I was playing the game, he said softly. But the truth is. He stood, adjusting his cufflinks. I am the game. Darius walked toward the door. Before he exited, he turned slightly over his shoulder. If you have concerns, he said, you're welcome to take it up with the board. What board? One of the men asked. Darius's smile deepened. The one I now control. He left the room without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Epilogue. Months later, headlines flashed across every major news outlet. Darius Bell takes control of major defense contract consortium. Influence of Innovis expands into political sphere. The most powerful man in America. Darius stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the city below. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, sharp, cold, dangerous. Tasha stepped beside him. You did it, she said softly. Darius's gaze didn't shift. No, he replied. His voice was quiet, steady. Absolute. I've only just begun.